Hello, history friends, and welcome to another live stream AP World Cram session. I'm very excited for this today. It's a double dip for me today because I was doing the Q&A this morning, which was great fun. Good to see some of you back for something more today. And I am seeing just the question in the chat that Jude brought up at first that, oh, hi, Sri Debbie, that question Jude brought up first, and other people are pinging in saying that it's not working. So that is something that we'll have to look into. And if anybody, don't see any Fivable peoples here, but they could ping Tan on our Slack channel. And if not, I'll do that when I'm done. So we'll get on that. Yeah, hey, and thank you very much. That was very sweet to see that today in Teacher Appreciation Week. Yeah, I do appreciate that. So I'm here in the north in St. Paul, Minnesota, broadcasting. I wonder if we have people, do we have anybody from around the world today? There was someone from India in the session this morning and someone from really fun map reading today for me. You did? I think I knew that part now. Home of the Strawberry Festival, I believe. That's nice. Yeah, I've been to Hopkins a few times. They teach AP World there. Good. All right, so let's take a peek. What we have going on today. I try to do a little more of a content focus. Okay, hey, can you hear me now? Yeah, okay, it's my bad. I've got this headset which which helps me block out the other noise from the neighborhood, my home, and then also picks my voice better. But I think I leaned back on the button that mutes it. Maya. Yeah, good. All right, very good. So let's take a peek. We have a lot of good stuff going on here with Fivable, as I think people are pretty aware. And some of you are playing the Olympics, I've noticed. So I hope that is going well for everyone. I saw King Dan up near, and William the Conqueror up near the top at one point, but not when I checked most recently. So keep up the good work there. And I know some people formed teams in the chat last week, so be good. Yeah. Great. We have, it's me and Mr. Little are both doing double duty this week. I was this morning and he went yesterday, and then he's going again on Thursday with the late medieval review. So that will bring together the topics from our first 3 sessions here for that, and then trivia. Next week, and then the week following, we have 2 weeks. And the exam, we'll be doing double duty. So we'll be doing the last time period, 1750 to 1900, in 3 sessions. So next week, Tuesday, and then Thursday, and then the following Tuesday, and then the night before the exam, the big 5-hour bump. With Mr. Little, we'll be kind of combining the things from units 1 and 2. I don't know if he'll do them in order, because they're not really in order. Like the unit 2 stuff it's all kind of happening at the same time. I'm answering a Spundin's question here. And then I did them in a slightly different way. You all know to follow us on the Fivables, and if you're new here, welcome, and you should know that there's TikTok too. All right, we're gonna start like we always do, or like I like to do, by taking a look at a source. And so this is a source that I did not include in the DBQ that is in the practice that we're working on in practice right now, but I nearly did. So without going into the ins and outs of which ones I did or didn't, this was almost the visual, but it's not. So why don't you go ahead and take a look, and then this would be what is in the poll, the second poll question. So you can check that out and then see which aspect of the sourcing would you think would be the best to go after if you were using this document. Using the same prompt that we have for the practice questions. So we have a Portuguese illustrator, and this is a map of the fortress at Mombasa, which I've had a photograph of in at least one of the streams I've done here. And it's from a book that was published with a very descriptive title Looks like I think we can assume this was a work of nonfiction. So somebody else wrote it, but so this is the name of the illustrator. And the specific audience in 1665 was the King of Spain and Portugal. It's not a huge thing, but to understand that, I'll tell you that the same person was the King of Spain and Portugal at that time. So there's about 80 years, more than 80, maybe 100 years, where the same person inherited both the throne, the kingship in both Spain and in Portugal. And so it was united. So they're still separate countries, just with the same king. All right, so why don't you let's take a look here in the poll. Yeah, I think it's neat looking. And then this is Fort Jesus, as the Portuguese say. All right, so if you did something like, say, if you did historical situation, then how is that influencing this document? So maybe that would be then influencing the creation of the document. Why was this created? Well, because a lot of people are going for historical. All right. Sorry about that. Historical, no, that's me. It's my bad. Historical situation here is, like, how does that affect the document? I gotta get this thing on the other side of me so I don't turn it off again. Okay, how does that affect the document, the historical situation? Right. So you have, when you're thinking about that, and when you're thinking about purpose, you want to think, who is this for? And one of the things with purpose to know is that the document purpose is never to answer our DBQ question, right? So you have to kind of think, what might it be, right? So the situation caused them to build these forts, and that's why the map exists. So this exists because there's multiple forts. No, I don't. You're okay, Tanya. Because there's multiple forts. Like if there was only one, it wouldn't be a very large book now, would it? So this winds up in a book because there's a lot of them. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, it's a little, I didn't know which way to do that. I want you to focus on the sourcing a lot, so I put it on top. As I've mentioned several times, the successful students universally report that they read the sourcing very closely, more closely than the source itself sometimes. So who's the audience for this? This document here. Who are the person who illustrated it? Yeah, it could be, right? So it might be showing this. It shows it as very strong. Yeah, the Portuguese. It's almost like an audience of one, kind of like I was mentioning today. Like deal with the cross history. Yeah. So so it might be. Now I don't know how you could exaggerate this. This is what the fort is shaped like. But it might, it does represent control. It doesn't show challenges to that. The Portuguese didn't universally control this fort. At different times, Swahili people overran the fort and took it over, and Omani Arab traders took it over for a time, kind of bounced back and forth. Of course, Mombasa winds up in British East Africa. It's part of Kenya today. So, it's like this shows a solidity to it that maybe didn't exist. Right. Yeah, I think it's showing that, so it does show that traditional means of power. Okay, so just always kind of working that skill, looking. So in some ways this is traditional, right? Because it's like a fort, like that's not new. But it's also like this is new for the Portuguese, right? Having this trading post empire, this extended thing overseas. Like that. Now it would be a good thing. How would this be a good bridge to bringing in outside evidence? Right. Well, what would you do if you wanted to pair this with a piece of outside evidence? Well, you could just bring in another place that the Portuguese, so maritime dominance that Lee has, that's the big idea. Then you'd want to support it with another example. So Spunden is going to bring in, is that who brought in Batavia? Yeah, so you bring in Batavia. Oh, right. Or she could also talk about the oh, right, because that's the Dutch. Yeah. You're right, Spunden. But yeah, Malacca. You could go that route. Or you bring in Brazil, right? Yep. Trading post empire might count as evidence, or it might count as kind of context. So you want just kind of, it's a little bit like word association. Like I say Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, you say trading post empire, you say Calicut, you say something else. Whoop, sorry. So if you're lost, what I'm saying is, what are some other facts that aren't in the image that you might use when you're using the image as evidence? So the image shows us a Portuguese fort in the Indian Ocean. And so then, yeah, Pratana has it there. The outside evidence then might be something that's similar to it. Or when I went off on that little tangent about other people who controlled Mombasa, that would be showing complexity, because it would be showing that they didn't always control it. But you could reinforce the point that this shows with another example of a place that Portugal controlled. Okay. Right. Yeah. Armed trade. Or it could be a place, or it could be the that passport system they use, the Cartaza. Right. Well, I think you could, Hania, you could look at this in a couple of different ways. So it'd be a traditional means, because, fortresses or something, like the Portuguese had fortresses, the kings of Spain and Portugal had castles. And so in that way, it's a traditional means. But you could also say that it's a variation on that traditional theme, because it's coming outside of, it's in the Indian Ocean. It's not a part of Portuguese territory. It's not on the mainland, so it's overseas. Yeah, Spunden has almost every one of those vowels right. There's one. I think it's like Albuquerque, like the Albuquerque, like the city. But that would work, right? Coming in and dominating, and then Malacca. Yeah. So those are, my point though is, those are all possibilities, right? If you don't remember Malacca, you don't remember Cartaza, but you do remember that Portugal set up a colony in Brazil, well, that would come in. Yeah, I think da Gama will count as context, yeah. And that could be, that would be contextualizing. You could use that as historical situation, or it could be evidence, kind of depending how you use it, or it could be context for the whole prompt, right? Well, I think what's innovative is controlling these territories far away from the home base. So that might be innovative, but like a fort itself is fairly traditional. So you could kind of have it a couple different ways. All right, let's kind of keep rolling here. But I think this, I like that. There's a bunch of these where, the rulers, they like maps of their territories. Okay, so we're going to take a look at our practice prompt from this past week on contextualization and thesis. We have one I'm going to highlight. There we are. And I'll get to some questions then. Then we'll go through and we'll get into the key concepts here for this time period. All right. So we know the deal here. And so we were looking at the first 2 points for the practice today. And with those first 2 points, you want to take a second shot at thesis at the end. And then your context can kind of be sort of anywhere. It can be in the middle, but the thesis has to be at the beginning and the end. Okay. The Cram contest was on sourcing, but this is what was in our link for last time. So if you want to see it in its natural state, you can look at the context and thesis practice. It's got the link symbol by it underneath here. Okay. So if you remember our elements of context, and really my new thing for talking to kids about this in a variety of settings is identify and explain. So identify what the context is, explain how it influenced the prompt. It's going to be true for everything. Okay. Same thing with a thesis. Identify how much. These evaluate to the extent to which questions are asking how much is something true. Right. You can do that with every one of the skills. And then explain how and or why. And so that's like an adverb plus because will be a good thesis. All right. So here is an exemplary piece that both Mrs. Longnecker and I liked. I think Mrs. Longnecker gave this feedback, and then I also liked it. So I have the thesis there. And one of my biggest suggestions for people, if you got the maybe in your response to the trying the context in the practice section this week, would be to be sure that you're connecting it into the prompt itself. And so sometimes if you're doing something that's before the prompt, then having sort of a chain of events can be a good way to do that. So here, Yori Tieni is saying, after the Mongols fell, other empires and states emerged after them. These states, such as the Qing dynasty in China and Peter the Great in Russia, so those are inside the prompt, had to find ways to consolidate power to make up for the loss of unity brought by the Mongols. So it's kind of making that connection. So it's explaining how the context is relevant to the topics that we're coming at here. So I would say my number one tip for people is explaining with the context. So there's a lot of really good identification of context. The explanation is, how does it relate to the prompt? And then the last part of this is the explaining part of the thesis. And I think because or by are both good words for getting this done. So by using traditional methods such as, and then kind of listing those things. And you can see those are fairly general, build up armies, and you can probably see which pieces of evidence are going to fit into that. Okay. Our practice for this week, if you hit the big green button there and go to the practice for this week, it is to make an outline. I'll talk about that in a minute. That's good news. It's all good news. Oh, Cram contest. Yeah. Could it be? So we're using the same thing. Now we're looking for concision. Yeah, to answer Juliana's question there about an although, that can help. Here's the thing. That can set you up for complexity, but it doesn't do it on its own. And if you don't have the although and you do complexity in the body paragraphs, you would still get it. So it's useful or helpful, but it's not necessary, nor is it sufficient. So you want to think of those althoughs happening throughout, like Hanya's commenting underneath there. That's a wise comment. Yeah, but it can help you get set up for it. There's like nothing wrong with doing that. Like the documents aren't all going to point in the same direction. So if you want to have that although in there. And it's also okay if your first thesis is pretty general, pretty straightforward, like it doesn't have complexity in it. Then when you get done, you're like, oh, wow, this is more complex than I realized. And then your second thesis is more complex. Totally cool. All right. I don't know why I had the thesis in there, that thing in there twice. And our winner is Ellipsis, who rolls as an ellipsis, I believe. The punctuation in the chat here. So I think I saw Ellipsis here written out on community and there. Yep. So let's take a look at what Ellipsis did. And I also have an honorable mention. Okay. So this did it. We got thesis and, right? See, love the affirmation of your peers. Maybe a little shy on the ellipsis. Yeah, it's good stuff. So here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. I find one that's good and I count the lines and I look for another one. Yeah, right. It's good stuff. So we have that. So you can see how it's doing. So this was working with evidence. So here it is. Explaining how the evidence supports a prompt, stressing importance of subject's loyalty, and then explaining how an aspect of sourcing, in this case purpose, is also related to the prompt and what's happening. Okay, so I thought this was very, very well done. And that would be 1 point for sourcing, and on the way to 2 points, you'd have to do it again for using the documents. Now there is an honorable mention here, and this one didn't win because the sourcing wasn't quite strong enough, but it did it in 3 lines, which is really great. And here's why that might be useful. When you're writing your DBQ 2 weeks from Thursday, you might really like dig into 2 of the documents. It's just like, wow, you're sourcing them, you're showing complexity, you're all over the place. And you use 2 pieces of outside evidence, and you feel okay about your thesis, and the content, the context is good. You're like, okay, 2 more documents. And you look, you got 5 minutes left. Can you interpret 2 different documents and use them as evidence in 5 minutes? Absolutely you can, because you are like rolling at this point. Yep. Well, 2 weeks and 2 days, partner. I mean, there's no reason to panic. Okay. So this is the affirmation of our peers and huge shout outs. I think I saw Olivia here congratulating others. So let's give that love straight back to Olivia. So we'll take a look here. And now this, well, 4 lines, I guess, is, yeah, you are welcome, Olivia. I thought this was really nice. And you've been a consistent participant with quality work, too. I'd like just to kind of point that out. So you can see here how the historical situation doesn't quite come back to interpreting the prompt, but she might be doing this in a situation where that's not key, where the key is to use it as evidence and get to those 4 pieces of evidence used. So this really shows you. And you can see one way that this works is starting with the source itself, because this is the kind of thing, these concise prompts that we're doing are the kind of thing that we're going to try to add on to existing arguments. Okay, so it's okay. So you want to start with the source and then do your connection as you're going through it. So yeah, that was a nice job. All right, this week's practice then, again, follow the big green button, is to outline your document or outline an essay. So this would be the kind of thing you would do after you go through the documents while you're reading them, and you're taking really super brief notes on how you might use them as evidence, and then you sort that out into what arguments might it be. So your argument should be less than 1 sentence. If these are too long, we're going to ask you to rephrase them before we grade them. Or give feedback. So we're trying to work on that concision thing. So your arguments, this would be like what you would write down in your notes, like shows traditional methods or traditional, just like a 1 word like that. And then you could just list what documents you would use and if there'd be a piece of outside evidence. So it might say something like 1, 2 Janissaries. That's what you would write after it for documents 1, 2, and Janissaries. So that's how you would just list the evidence. Don't describe it, because it's just how would you outline the essay. And then you come up with a thesis, which might be a variation on what you did for last week if you took part in that. Yeah. I was just doing a Google search for free clip art with writing, and I saw one based on Snoopy. And you may or may not realize this, but Charles Schulz is from St. Paul. Well, he's passed now, but Charles Schulz lived in St. Paul, Minnesota. I mean, St. Paul, man, really goes on about it. He spent most of his life in Santa Barbara, but he definitely grew up here, and so... there we are. Yeah, right on. We got some Minnesota action. There was someone from Battle Lake in this stream this morning, William. I was like, right on. At least according to the little map deal. Yep, Jake, are you repping Stearns County as well with Williams? This is the kind of Minnesota knowledge we got here, is county level data. Okay. So let's take a peek at this here. I think I will look at the questions. I'm going to go ahead and look at the questions while this is up in case people want to read it, because that's a lot of text. All right. Oh, we have a... Okay. So Spondon asks about Cram students responding after the deadline. We usually go after the deadline for a little bit, but then we need to close it when we open up the new one. So for this one that just passed, Spondon, if you want to just email me context, that's fine, because that should only be 3 sentences. And then your thesis can go into the practice prompt we have starting up this week. With the Cram contest, those have to end, so I can pick one with that. So we do that. Juliana asked this question. A number of people I'm sure, are curious about this. So according to the College Board, and this was Vice President for AP, Trevor Packer himself, if you don't know who that is, you should just feel good about that, kids. You don't need to know. But he said that as long as the uploading is initiated before the time goes out, it will continue to upload. So if you start on time, you don't push it. But if you start on time and then your connection's slow and it's continuing to upload after the 50 minutes have gone by, your submission will be graded. Okay. All right. Partner asks, if you talk about an important vocabulary word, would that be outside evidence or analysis? That is outside evidence, but you have to use analysis to explain how it relates to the prompt or how it relates to your argument. Like, what does it show that's connected to the prompt? So you'd have that vocabulary word like trading post empire and our Portugal thing. So that's one of those power words, right? Or pieces of evidence. But then you'd have to explain, in this case, that would maybe be an innovation, not a traditional method, this like armed trade. All right. Okay. I'm going to answer this question too. So Maya asks, and she has a smiley face in her name, which is very nice. Thank you, Maya. First thesis and intro and second in conclusion. I'm not used to writing two, so I'm a little confused. Okay, you don't have to write two. So let me just start with that. You want to think of it, your second thesis is basically like your conclusion. And the idea is that your argument might have shifted a bit while you're writing. So you might have one idea, then you write it, now you have another idea. The reader's going to give you credit for whichever one is better. So if your concluding thesis is better than your first thesis, that's the one that will score. So think of it like a miniature conclusion. And you might have done some more things, so it might be more complex. Okay. All right. I'm going to come back to some of these other questions, and you can upvote or add other questions. And I'll take a look at them again next time we're kind of paused. I have another link, and if you have a question, drop it in the, I think it gives you an option for adding it to ask a question. So I have a link in underneath that says no, don't worry, you don't have to be sorry, Splendid. I'm just telling you that's where I'll see it then. I just can see the question mark. If you look at the resources underneath, it says review chart for this stream, and that is editable right now. So you might link to the document there, and I know some of you have kind of asked for those, so I thought, well, I can put this into a Google Doc. And then you can make a copy of it, do it yourself. This is a different way of doing it when you start to review, where you're trying to find out where things go. So you might think, magnetic compass, like where does that go? And you'd kind of think, what is that? Well, it's technology, and it's definitely in the late medieval. Right. So you do that kind of thing. So remember, this sorting of what you already know is always the most important deal. All right, here's the power vocab for our current topic on production and economy and society. I think these are a good idea for the power vocab. So as these come up, you can ask a question if you're not sure what it is, or you could type in what you think it means. So these are words that could be in the prompt or could be useful as organizers for your body paragraphs. So labor systems are part of production systems. So what does it mean to labor? If you are laboring, what are you doing? Okay, so a system means how is that human work? How is that organized systematically? So for example, if you have a job now, you're probably getting paid a wage, getting paid by the hour. You know, teenagers, that's the most common thing. So wage labor is a way of organizing labor. It's not super organized because you or your employer could kind of cut it off at any time, but it does have the advantage of flexibility. Something like serfdom is the opposite of that. This word comes up a lot, and it's really useful to be able to use it fluently. So elites means people at the top, right? And so you're going to get some new elites in this time period. With that, well, labor unions, I saw that come in from Jayla, thank you. Labor unions isn't so much a labor system as it's a response to wage labor. So we have that. And so elites are people at the top, and we're going to have new and old elites. And then this word here, demographics, is going to come up. So demographics means information or maybe visual data related to human beings. So the most basic demographics is, oh yeah, Juliana's got it, right. Population change, and that's, you know, the most basic level, how many people are there, but also what kind of people and how do we categorize the people and something like that. All right, so a lot of these are going to be different things. Some of you are already mentioning this. This is a tiny bit outside the time period, but it's reflecting back on things before the time period. So what do you think this is here? I'm pouring myself a little more oolong tea. Seems like a better idea now than it will later tonight, but it's really delicious. Okay, yeah, I think we're seeing a few of these different things right here with the different castas. Okay, great. Maybe it's an interesting question, is an Uspan What's the Espanol, the Spaniard, and the Mulata. And I don't know, because in colonial Spain it was more flexible than in the English colonies. So a person who had some non-European ancestry could still be white in a way that wasn't true in the English colonies. Yeah, right. Yeah, possibly. There you go. Okay, what's going on here? You can see a few different things. You know what they're making here? So the labor system here would be chattel slavery. Yep, it is sugar. You're going to crush the sweet juice out of it. So you could have that. And it does show a production system because it takes a lot of investment in order to do it. Okay, so Julianne's asking a really good question here. So what would production system, how would that be different than labor system? Well, first of all, production system is an overall category that would include labor systems. Okay. Production system would also include like how it's organized and funded. So here, like a plantation includes plantation ownership. It includes, whoever's overseeing the labor, includes investment. And yeah, this is from Brazil. It is. It's from when the Dutch controlled Brazil. It's a Dutch drawing, but it's from Brazil. And it is, I found this by Googling the word ingenio. So nice work, Splendid. Very good. So here we're seeing investment because the sugar production equipment required a lot of upfront investment. Now, typically, plantation agriculture with chattel slavery is not seen as capitalist, but there is a lot of capital investment. So the production system here could be having a large plantation, so like a big chunk of land with a lot of investment in equipment. Now, the labor that's working that could be indentured, it could be enslaved, it could be wage, it could be debt peonage. So the production system would be the same, but there could be different labor systems. But for our purposes here, you want to kind of think of investment and business part of it also included in that. It's like those. This picture was not this dark, I learned, and I included like a 6-minute video on it because it's a beautiful piece of art. Oh, good. Okay, so if you take a look here, yeah, so these are, and this is in Amsterdam. It's a Rembrandt painting showing, and it wasn't originally called The Night Watch because it's not actually during the daytime. It got dark over time. Or it's not actually during the nighttime, right? But showing new elites, this bourgeoisie, the urban elite, the business people who were, the new elite in the more capitalist and mercantile Europe. Somebody had this one earlier when elites came up. That's right. Middle class. But middle class doesn't mean middle income. It means not noble in European history. So they could be super rich, like bankers. They make bank, like literally, right? So it's a kind of elite, but they're not noble. All right, so here we have some elites here. Yep, the Zamindars, which are sometimes Hindu, sometimes Muslim, as this elite class in South Asia. This is in what's today Bangladesh. All right. Let's take a look here at what we mean here by production systems. Now, META, I think sometimes it is tax farming, William, and sometimes it's more straight up. I was looking at it, it gets a little, it starts to get a little complicated. Okay. So here's our context for this. We got two different things here. We got these new global empires, and we have all this exchange. So there's got to be more production. Otherwise, there can't be more trade, because if not, like, what are they trading, right? So we have to also think about production. At the same time, we're thinking about more trading. Okay. I think to answer Rosa's question, it looks like some people have it here. Okay. About that, whether or not Zamindars are, we can think of them as tax farmers or not. I'm not totally sure. And I think it could vary. Okay. So agriculture continues to intensify during this time. I want you to take a look at the pictures here. So what intensifying means is that there's more calories, more nutrition being produced from each square foot of land. Oh, those are actually not yams. Those are sweet potatoes, which are different. but you're on the right track. I got that. Here. So during this time, there's more agricultural production that's happening in a variety of ways. And some of that is new crops like sweet potatoes and maize or corn, and potatoes going to Europe and the manioc going to Africa. And that's producing more calories. We have that. There's also expansion of where people are farming. So the picture in the lower left shows Russian peasants, and they're moving out, right? King Dan has got it in the lower right-hand corner. We've moved from a 3-field system to a 4-field system. With that, I don't think those are Cossacks, because Cossacks are like nomadic or herds people more generally. So I think they're heading up, but there were Cossacks who did settle in Siberia. So we got that. No, not boyars. Boyars means the traditional Muscovite nobility. These would be peasants, but they're being encouraged to head out into Siberia to bring more land under cultivation. And then in China, you just continuing to farm more land and more intensively. So that's going to mean these new crops like corn and sweet potatoes, peanuts in China. And so all of these things are running up against the edge of how much the land can produce. So you don't need to know all these examples, but we have a lot, the agricultural production is intensifying. Okay. And since agricultural households are producing more, then there's more people in those households who can do labor. And we see a few of these here. 4 of these pictures are related to production of what? What's always the answer? Yeah, spunden. The answer is always textiles. Well, not always, but often, right? So we have cotton textiles from India and woolen textiles from Britain and silk textiles from Japan, and probably silk from Japan in the lower right, and then silk from China in the upper right, and then also porcelain that we have here. So since there's more people buying these things, you have to know that there's more of it being made. And so how's that happening? Well, people are making more in their homes. And so before the Industrial Revolution, some historians will talk about an industriousness revolution, because most people are still agricultural, full stop. But more of those people are also engaging in cottage industries, as people are tossing out in the chat, or sometimes that's called the putting out system. Cottage industry is a little thing. Yep, sometimes people will call it proto-industrialization. That's yes, Arosa. So you talk about that. And so kind of what's happening is you have like a back and forth. There's more products available, so people have more incentive. And this is in different parts of the world. So people have more incentive to produce for the market to earn money. If you go back to the early medieval period, most people are producing for their own subsistence. There is trade, of course, mostly in luxury goods, but most people are at the subsistence level, and most things that they use, they don't buy, they make. And so as a result, they don't have a lot of them. As more things become available, then there's more incentive for people to try to earn money. And as people earn more money, there's more incentive for merchants to provide things. It kind of works in a few ways. And as there's more trade, landowners in places like India have incentive to pressure their peasantry to produce things for market in addition to food. So we have that. To answer Lee's question here, I think those two words are similar enough that one of them wouldn't be considered a cause or effect of the other. So cottage industry and proto-industrialization. But that could be something that could be outside evidence on a DBQ for sure, especially if you named an industry. So I think textiles would probably be the way to go there. But there's other things besides textiles. There's people like braiding straw to make hats. That's just one example. Now with the porcelain, what we're seeing is bigger production scale. So closer to what we would think of as capitalism, with more investment and larger, more intensive production in China. So the Chinese porcelain industry is really getting to be at really very large scale. And it's one of the big historical questions, like, was China capitalist in the early modern period? But it doesn't go on to become globally capitalist in the same way as the Europeans. So does that mean they weren't capitalists? So that's a pretty deep question. But at our level, we can know that the Chinese porcelain production was increasing. And so that's part of why, they're trading so much of it. They're making it really large scales. So if you read some of these documents, it's like these are really large kilns. So they're putting, thousands of bowls like this are going in at a time. So it's not quite it kind of is like a factory. It's not mechanized completely, but it's at scale. So this is always underlying things like that. So what does capitalism mean? Well, this is one of those terms that when students are younger, they get kind of a baby definition of it, and it's really kind of hard to understand. And as you go through school, you have to keep making your definition of it more complex. So one of the things that typifies capitalism as a system is individual ownership and competition between businesses. And that's true. But the defining feature in capitalism is the scale of investment. That's right. But what I'm saying for free trade and laissez-faire is that those things are not sufficient to define something as capitalist. Because if you go back to ancient world, like in Chinese market towns and in the ancient Mediterranean, there's free trade. Like people, Janimi. I would love to pronounce your name correctly. So if that doesn't isn't too awkward, you could just pop that in there. Was that good, or Janimi? It's close. Okay, all right. I'm committed to getting better, but Janimi has it right there. The joint stock companies, because what the joint stock does is it raises funds for investment to invest more things. So that's why I have the stock exchange in the lower right, and that's why I have this sugar mill in the top right. Yeah, right. Now Rose is bringing in the limited liability corporation into this system. So that's where people could invest their money, and then if the company goes belly up, they get to make the profits, but they're not on the hook for the debts. It's kind of a scam, but that's how that would work. Okay, so we're looking at capital investment that's going to increase the amount of production. It's also going to change who profits. Right. So we have these things. And it's really important to understand that even though the rhetoric of laissez-faire gets applied to this, that these things are all state sponsored. So the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, is sponsored by the Dutch government. On the left there, that's the Royal African Company's Charter, which is sponsored by King Charles II. It starts out with King Charles. I put that Queen Elizabeth document in our practice to kind of make that point. So all this stuff is all sponsored by the state. So maybe we'll talk a little more about laissez-faire next time, but it's really more aimed at getting rid of mercantilist kinds of things. And it's meant to, it's what's just like today. People want government protection for themselves, but they don't want government interference. It's not that different from how people just kind of normally react. The bottom middle question is in Madras. It's East India Company Fort in southeastern India coast. Also a place where they make really nice cottons. All right, so we have our labor systems here, and people are already popping some of these off before. So of course we have the continued slave trade and then the much larger slave trade. I think, yep, some people we got the Meta there for the top right. It's good. That's a peasant serf in stocks in the top middle. You have that. Yep, we got our Lips is coming in with encomienda. The encomienda is real. It doesn't last for real long, but it is a good example, and it's mostly in the Spanish Mediterranean. We have all these things. I think it's important with slavery to know that slavery had kind of always existed in different ways, but you do need to understand how chattel slavery is different, and you want to understand how there's a difference in the number of slaves. Like ancient Rome is kind of a slave society, but there were a lot of other societies that historians will call societies with slaves. And that's different than a society that enslaves. So the idea that a society where there is slavery is different than a society where slavery is the basis of the economy. Like the American South was a slave society. Like it's a huge chunk of the economy, but slavery did exist in other places. This is really more about not so much about a value judgment as it is about how does labor organized to do things. Okay, I'm going to take a couple questions here because I see some in the chat. I'm going to put the social structure here. Oh, good. And Mrs. Longnecker is answering the meta question. And serfdom would be, that was the top middle picture back there, Jude, with the person being punished. So serfs could be physically abused. They couldn't leave the land. And during this time period, serfdom was actually increasing in Eastern Europe while it was decreasing in Western Europe. So, all right. I'm going to put this picture up for people to look at and think about. And I'm going to take a look at these questions so they don't come at the very end when we're just like, that here. Okay. So I'm going to answer some questions. So Lee is curious about how many body paragraphs you should have. And Mrs. Longnecker gives the good advice that there's like no for sure answer. But I would say that the general kind of rule of thumb of 2 to 3 is good. You want to have at least 2, so you're kind of dividing your thoughts up, so it's not just one big blurb, you know. So you want to do that, and you can always wind up adding another one, but there is not a set number. What is important, I think, is to think about using your evidence together to prove points. That's how it's going to naturally lead to sourcing. It might lead to complexity. All right, Juliana asked, does outside evidence have to be super specific? And I would say it kind of depends, and the advice here for Mrs. Longnecker is good, as specific as you can be. But like something like Trading Post Empire could be like a piece of evidence in this situation. It's a little bit different when you take a push, or if you've had a push where really it needs to be a proper noun. Here it could be something more specific like nutmeg. So you could always think, if you think of an answer and then ask yourself, can I think of a specific example of this? So if you're like, well, spices, that's what people were after in the Indian Ocean, then just ask yourself the question, can you think of a spice that they're after? And there's a lot of possibilities. And if you can't, well, then that's okay. Just keep rolling. But if you can, then go ahead and do that. So I wouldn't kind of rack your mind too much about it. Okay. I'll do one more question I'm going to roll through. And this is Spunden's question, where he's asking about having trouble with analysis when you're rushing. To restate the prompt, I think that is a good start. So I would echo that. I think sometimes if you're rushing and you do just kind of rephrase the prompt, like there's nothing wrong with that. That's just a way to get writing. Don't beat yourself up about it, but then do continue again to identify. Just think in terms of identify and explain. So I think you can kind of, that's my new thing. So you're going to hear me say that some more, but it's a good way to kind of settle yourself down. Identify what's my answer to the prompt after you've restated it, and then why. Identify and explain. Okay. And just know you can take a second shot at it. I think one of the most important things with this year's exam especially is just to keep writing, because it's set up to keep anyone from being able to really finish it. So it's important that you just keep going. And this is, when I was a reader, this is one of the things I thought kids would start out and they would, you know, it wasn't very good. And then as they're going, it's just getting better. It's like, oh, that's great. So we're not grading it holistically. You know, as a reader, you're just looking for those things. So just keep writing. If you get stuck somewhere, just skip, move on. You can always come back and put it in there. Right. So let's take a peek here. I think the main thing that I would want you to know about this is that racial categories, the way we think of them, not just all the categories that you might have learned about in the Castas system, but categories that are more familiar to present day America, like white or black, that those were created during this time period. It's not until the 1600s that people are like writing down and describing people in categories where their appearance is like very correlated with other factors, and they're in these big groups the way we think about it. So we want to kind of think about, where does that come from? That doesn't mean that people in the past didn't have prejudices about how people looked, but the notion that these would be social categories that were impossible to get out of and had really huge implications, that's not something that happened. And of course, ancient people, you know, those things are very fluid. So in any case, so where do these racial categories come from? Well, like I was saying, in Latin America, colonial Latin America, there are there's laws, and those laws don't have all the various in-between castas. That castas means caste or class, that people that would have existed in a painting like this. But they did specify those main ones, peninsulares. Janimi, the social Darwinism won't come till later, until we get actual Darwinism. So you want to kind of hold that off here. Yeah, that's right, Herbert Spencer. So that's going to be late 1800s. And really, and the lesson here is that society became a lot more racist over time. Well, it's okay. That's what we're doing, is we're sorting our evidence a row. So that's a good piece of evidence. So things got worse. I mean, it's basically the most racist stuff in American history is written in the 1800s, when people are defending slavery as it's ending, not in the 1600s when it's starting and all that stuff's still getting sorted out. So the regulations by colonial states and the association of certain people with certain kinds of labor created the basis for categorizing people this way. And then science. So this is before Darwin, and it's not quite as hello. Am I back? Sorry about this. This will be our little joke for today. Yeah. Thank you, McKinney. It's good to have you all here. Okay. So we're looking at social structures. All right. Now there's a whole bunch of things. So there's way more terms here than I expect anybody to know. But these are elites, and some of them are old elites that are now reinvented in different ways, or elites that are still elite, even though other things have changed. You might even just kind of think about what's the broader society that these places are a part of. Caciques are indigenous leaders in Native American people in Spanish America who were leaders of their communities. They're kind of intermediary. So like if you learned about indirect rule and later imperialism, caciques could be descended from Incas, or you would have in different places. So this person here is Diego de Torres. So he's taken a Spanish name, is assimilated, and he was a community leader. So, and this is an important thing to put in there, because it's like in a lot of places, the Spanish, they allowed like the Republico de los Indies, or de los Indios, the Indian Republic, and then there was the Spanish Republic, and they kind of exist in the, it doesn't mean republic like in the, like you can vote and there's no king and stuff, but just meant the community. And so as long as people were converting to Catholicism, the Spanish king was interested in protecting Indian people. Very different than the exterminationist kind of program that English settlers were going through. So caciques were kind of intermediaries, and sometimes they did come from the traditional thing. So again, if there's any of these words you don't know, I mean, now is not the time to be like memorizing some of these things. But if you do know them, it's a way to think of them. These are elites. So like bourgeoisie, the Qing banner system. So since the Qing came in, they were Manchu. The elite positions in the state initially went to Manchu people instead of to ethnically or culturally Chinese people. Now over time they adopt and they kind of meld some things together, but it does show how there's new elites because there's that conquest. Okay, so I would say Janimi is talking about the samurai, right? So that would be an elite, and during this time, they're transitioning from being a warrior class to more of a bureaucratic class, like kind of tough and tender, right? Writing poetry and also maintaining some military skills. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I didn't include the Ottomans, but Spundan is right. That would be another example. There will be no situation where you have to know more than one of these, but I don't think. But knowing one, could be useful. Might fit into our question that we have here today. All right, last topic. Then I'll do questions at the end. So if you have any questions, you can load them in there. This kind of fits in with last week, and it also fits in with the social structures, because all these things we were talking about last week with empires, there's resistance to all those. And the way we color in maps and stuff in history really overstates how much control the empires had. So again, this is another way to show complexity. Maybe not in our question that we have now, but like in that Portuguese in the Indian Ocean one, it's like, well, the Portuguese expanded, they controlled things, but then complexity is like, well, but not everywhere and not totally, and showing the limits of that. It's an interesting thing when I was going image hunting for these deals, that there's so much of the people who were involved in resistance are memorialized as like heroes now, even if they weren't successful. So the person in the bottom right there, that's Bajirao the First, who was a Maratha leader. So that's West Central India, which were states. It was a confederation, then eventually an empire that resisted the Hindus. Yeah, I think Jude's right that Metacom's war would be an example of this, resisting that resistance. The statue in the middle is of Pope, who is a leader of the Fivable revolt in New Mexico, which is later than Metacom, but the same idea. Got Queen Nzinga there. And I put all these words on here in case people wanted to spell them. So that's why there's more words here. Okay, so Queen Nzinga was a leader of African, I forget which one, Ndongo, in what's today Angola. So not the king of Congo, Ndongo. Great, thank you, Dan. And so she negotiated with the Portuguese. So it wasn't always violent, sometimes cooperated with, but worked hard to kind of maintain her community's integrity, even though the Portuguese were expanding. So the Portuguese are still basically a trading post, like Luanda, what's today the capital of Angola. That was a trading post, and the Portuguese controlled the post, but you get outside the post, it's kind of anybody's game. So she was part of that. So the Maratha would be an Indian community. Like today, we might categorize that as Hindu, although that probably wouldn't have been, that just means Indian at that time in history. So like the people who were the leaders of the Maratha state, they wouldn't have thought of themselves as being equal to people who were maybe in different castes or in different ethnic groups from different parts of India. So that Hindu identity as like a broad thing is newer. But the Marathas resisted the Mughal Empire and then later resisted the British. The British get into fights with the Marathas also. So a semi-independent state in central India. We have that. The two Congos border each. Oh, Mrs. Longneckers got it. This painting here is a Cossack rebellion. Someone asked a question about the Cossacks today. That's time stamped in the replay, and I talked about it for 4 minutes. So if you're interested, you can check that out. This painting was done in the 1800s and is meant to, again, to memorialize that. So resistance is often happening on the edge of empires as they're expanding, or what was the edge at the time. Then there's also, of course, internal resistance. And again, there's a lot of memorialization here. That picture of Queen Nanny of the Maroons is on one of the Jamaican large denomination bills. So Maroons were communities of free slaves, or people, not free slaves, that's like an oxymoron. People who were formerly enslaved or descended from formerly enslaved people who escaped. And there's these communities like from the very beginning. So like in Brazil and Jamaica, we have that. Is it 500? Nice. So, well, they're in the bigger Caribbean islands, Maroon communities, like in, seeing up in the highlands, and then also in Brazil. Brazil, as you might notice, very large. So there's communities there that have existed for a long time. So those are Maroons. The Fronde, that's in the course and exam description. You don't have to know that. It's the kind of thing that can come up. The Fronde was a revolt against the absolute monarchy in France, and it kind of turned into a civil war. The word Fronde, which I'm probably not pronouncing right, means slingshot. And then so like these street kids would like smash things, like throw things with slingshots and smash them open. Fun fact: King Louis XIV was a kid when this was happening, and he was traumatized because these people in the streets in Paris like threw mud at his carriage, and it scared him. And That might be part of why he was such an absolutist. Maybe it's just a good story. I don't know. But so the Fronde shows the resistance to absolutist tendencies in France. And that's the German peasants revolt in the lower left. So there's peasant revolts in Europe, like continue through this time too. So people who are not being, people who are getting the worst of the situation economically, they will continue to rebel. All right, 7 o'clock. I am going to take another quick look at questions. So you can drop them in there and then we'll wrap this up. Also, I do a little bit of the tweeting, so you can check me out there. But I would rather let our eyes linger here on these people who do refuse to submit. So let's take that up. Okay, so if you have any more questions, you can drop them in, and we can do that. Yeah, okay, here we go. This is a good question to have. There's a nice answer in here, but for the replay. By the way, even if Mrs. Longnecker has a good answer, I still say it, even if I'm really basing it on what she says, because then it's in the replay. So I'm not trying to mansplain anything here, or like a 52-year-old mansplain or whatever we got going on. Just want to be sure that people who are on the replay can see. So the question asks, how would you set up a sentence that gets the sourcing point in your DBQ? So again, what you want to think of, Jayla, and for others who are interested in this, again, is identifying the aspect of the sourcing and then explaining why it, or how it affects the document, or how it fits in with your argument. So as I've mentioned before, but I think it's worth thinking about, to do that identify part, words like as or since or because can be very useful. So like, since this was written to the king, and then you follow that up with what effect is there in the document. And in my opinion, one of the keys is to have something from the sourcing line in the document. And that's why I want you to look at that sourcing line even before you look at the document real closely. Something that's in there, and then something that's evidence of who the source was that's inside the document itself. You have to think about the source and the document as somewhat separate. And then how is some element of the sourcing present in the document itself? It could also be in terms of how you use the document. Like the example from the Qing that Ellipsis had for us, which was that they're intending this to like stamp out different thought. And so that shows us that controlling thought is a way. Since this was their purpose, it shows that this is, what they were trying to do. So you can also use it in your document like that. But again, start by identifying and then moving to, and you can do that in one sentence, and then moving to explaining how it affects the document or your argument. All right, similar question from Olivia, which is, is it better to be obvious with your sourcing, example, the intended audiences, or to make the essay flow better? And I think the advice here from Mrs. Longnecker is great, whatever is easier to write. So don't worry too much about flow. It's okay to be really obvious here. You can, there's a kind of an in-between spot, where you're turning some stuff into you could turn that noun or that adjective intended into a verb, like so-and-so intends, there's intending to write to. But I wouldn't get too hung up on that. Again, my biggest advice for people is just to keep writing. So you just keep writing because you're trying to pick up as many points as you can. It's one of those things like, I don't know, there used to be this game show, was it like Supermarket Sweep or something? I think Amanda, the Queen of Fivable, was a big fan of this thing. And so somebody, they're just trying to get as much stuff in their cart as they can. It's a pretty crude show, but, not crude like gross, but, crude in its approach. So you're just trying to so that's what you're doing. It's like, well, you know what it is. It's like Hungry Hippos. You're just trying to get as much stuff as you want. Like you want your hippo to get the most marbles. So you don't want to get stuck on something. So don't worry too much about that. Supermarket Sweeps, is that it? Yeah, it's still out there somewhere, I'm sure. I think something tells me that Amanda really enjoyed that, but I might be wrong. Right, I kind of answered the other sourcing question in the same way, and then the same thing here from Ellipsis. So we do have some other questions that are All right, Rose is asking, what are the main methods of consolidating power? So maybe we could put some of those into the chat for people could think of. What is that? But you could think of ways. Consolidating power is going to be about getting people. So you kind of think of it two ways. So if a ruler wants to have power, like get people to do what they want, they can either force them to do it, but you can't do that all the time. So then you have to also be persuading them. So it's going to be some sort of mix of force and persuasion. And you can't make everybody happy, so you might need to make some people happy. So think of it that way. What is the ruler doing to create force that makes it less likely for people to challenge them? What are they doing to get other people to support them because it's their benefit too? And then what are they doing to get people to accept their rule? Right. So Dow in the chat says, grand architecture. Right. So grand architecture is meant to get people to be afraid to rebel or want to support the state because it's cool. Like, look, we built this thing, people feel proud of it. So we can do that. Yep, Ellipsis has some answers in there. There we go. All right. With your document, it's going to be, so this question is from King Dan, and he's asking, is it easier to go with the parentheses for citing a doc or saying this doc shows analysis? Again, I would say like whatever's going to be smoothest for you. Here's what I like. Here's what my recommendation is, but it's a really soft recommendation. My recommendation is to use the name of the author or whoever's creating it, the creator of the document, like as the subject in a sentence. And then at the end of that sentence, you put the document in there and you explain how they're doing what they're doing. Okay. Again, you identify who they are, like what are they saying? So here we have Ambassador Busbek, reports, observed, whatever, a whole lot of camels. And this shows that the Ottoman state could put a lot of soldiers on the field, in the field to fight, which is a traditional means of consolidating power. So then you kind of, then at the end of that sentence, you'd have parentheses doc 1 or D1. I think that's a good way to do it, but you can definitely get every single point in the rubric if you're like in document 1, the author says, that's going to work too. So don't get too hung up on those things. But when you're practicing, I think that's the smoothest because that will more naturally lead you into doing sourcing analysis because you've mentioned the person's name or something about them. Okay, I'm going to do one more here. I'm going to do one more here. And I'm going to stop for a second here, and then I'm going to do it again. Sorry. As I see Dan's thing there, I tell my kids to use the parentheses too. What I'm just saying, because that's, if you have more time in class and things like that. And so I think that is best practice. So I'm not going to undermine that. But I'll say this. When push comes to shove, you just got to go and you write. But I think that's best practice. Okay. Yeah, that'd be good. No, I think we're suggesting the same thing. I'm not sure. Okay. All right. Hey, Juliana asked, when will be the next opportunity to practice writing theses? It's this week. Hit the big green button, Juliana. It's right there. You should have a thesis after your practice essay. All right. So, yep, I'd love to see it. We would, Mr. Little and Mrs. Longnecker and I, we would love to see your answer there. So, okay, well, that is all I had. There was a consolidating, legitimizing question. I think we got to in the other discussion. You can feel free to ask me or email me, or we can come up again. So, Mr. Little will be talking about the late medieval period, so back to where we started on Thursday. And I think we've got some really good recently recorded replays. If you're looking to do some more stuff, I thought Mrs. Longnecker's last Thursday was really good on this same time period, covered a lot of things. And I also think Mr. Little's on globalization on Monday was quite good. So, and mine today was more focused on the writing part. So you can check that out. So if those of you stuck around, it's okay if you had to go. There's other good stuff happening, but thank you so much. We're looking forward to your readings. Yes. All right. Janimi, I am excited to have you here. You've added a lot to the chat, and we've got a good mix of the old and the new people whose names I recognize from the writing. Ella Will, very nice. McKinney, I know you're very loyal. Yes, Aditi, Courtney. Right now I have heard, I know I mentioned this last week, but there are dragons in Manhattan. It's nice to see some of you here. So Ellipsis, nice work. And we will see you soon.